Just need to test.
Okay, now I think it's a good time, I think, to start for the first session today, I guess. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome every participants from Thailand and abroad to the first event under the PSU Open Mobility 2022 project. And in this session, our invited speaker will go through quite a complex and controversial issue with significant impacts on English language teaching and learning, currently not only in Thailand, but also in many other countries around the world. And today's topic is going to be about promoting decolonizing pedagogy through languaging case study. And before we jump up into the intense controversy, please allow me to briefly introduce our speaker, Associate Professor Dr. Fang. Fang obtained his PhD from the Center for Global Englishes, University of Southampton in the UK. He is currently Associate Professor at College of Liberal Arts, Shantou University, China. And his research interests include global Englishes, sociolinguistics, language attitude, identity, intercultural communication, teacher education, and language teaching and learning. Fang has published articles in journals, including Asia Pacific Journal of Education, ASEAN Englishes, ELT, English Today, and Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development, and among others. His latest books include a monograph titled Repositioning Accent Attitude in the Global Englishes Paradigm, and published by Routledge, and an edited book, an edited volume co-edited with Dr. Handoyo Widodo, and titled Critical Perspective on Global Englishes in Asia, and published by Multilingual Matters. And now to cut the chase, I'm going to let our speakers to continue with the session. Associate Professor Dr. Fang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yusuf, for your kind introduction. And thank you very much for your invitation again. It's my great honor and pleasure to join this program. Before I start, can I just make sure, like, how long is this talk about? So.
Okay, you can talk about 1 hour and 30 minutes, and after that it can be like a Q&A session.
Okay, sure, thank you.
More than 2 hours, let's say.
Okay, so yeah, let me try to share the screen, because yeah, I checked the time because I would like to share about this topic, and I know that this is a research topic that people are interested in. And it's also very important in applied linguistics from my perspective and from scholars on translanguaging. And it's not only, like, for me, it's not only a theory or a tool or a practice or even a method in language teaching and in researching language education, but also it's the kind of whatever ideology or paradigm or method to promote inclusive education and decolonizing pedagogy. So I will spend about 1 hour talking about the theory, the theoretical bit, and one of my empirical studies, and another 30 minutes talking about the research trend on translanguaging, especially when we look at translanguaging as a method, right? Translanguaging as a method. Okay. Yep. Okay. Promoting decolonizing pedagogy through translanguaging. Let me see how to. Okay, I'll start with the important applied linguistics or relevance to the issue of power and this various ideologies of Englishes, power and unequal Englishes in ELT. And I'm going to introduce a case study and put forward for how the researchers and educators can revisit translanguaging as a way of teaching, promoting inclusive education, etc. Okay. So one of the first concept that I know when we regard language, right, as part of like race, especially about racial linguistics, it's all about language ideologies and hierarchy, right? And there is certain linguistic racism, linguistic discrimination. It's about, from Dovchin, it's about the ideologies and practices that are utilized to conform, normalize, and reformulate an unequal and uneven linguistic power between language users, including first language use, language accent, etc. I think previously, if you are interested in global English study, world English study, there are many studies on accents and identity from the world English's perspective, global English's perspective. But now scholars seem to look at this from a broader perspective, from not only accents or even identity, but from the language as a whole, language use as a whole, and in relations to power, in relation to language discrimination or linguistic racism. Okay, so an earlier concept called linguicism, if you're familiar with, ideologies and structures which are used to legitimate, effectuate, and reproduce unequal division of power and resources, both material and non-material, between groups which are defined on the basis of language. Okay, and linguistic imperialism, you see that Philipson also developed this concept to language education, to language use, to various fallacies, right, of language use. So this is all about the idea of how we view language in social use from this social perspective. And if we are sensitive, if we're more sensitive, we will see this is related and is there in our daily life, in our daily practice. But sometimes people do not recognize this, right? But we really need to discuss all the various issues. For example, like the Costa mentioned, that the concept like linguistic racism needs to be historicized and examined in relation to the socio-political contexts in which multilingual speakers are embedded, right? There is a transition era, I would say, in applied linguistics and in language education, that many speakers, users, are multilingual speakers. We are not really monolingual speakers. So some traditional teaching methods and some traditional language ideologies might not be applicable, right, in today's language teaching and language education. And even some traditional methods, approaches would create this kind of hierarchy or those kind of racism or discrimination. Yeah, whether consciously or unconsciously, especially for language educators, sorry, excuse me, for language educators who don't really want to discrimination or linguistic racism. So it also has to be examined in conjunction with vitally important and adjacent work on linguistic, I just mentioned the definition of linguicism, and I think people are familiar with native speakerism. I'll introduce this concept later. And racial linguistics, all very powerful in relation to language use in society, language and those kind of hierarchy. Okay, so we will see the use of English is very complicated. From the traditional world Englishes, we talk about various varieties of English. We talk about the outer circle varieties of English, but also we see that English is used as the regional lingua franca among many national languages or local dialects. Again, I don't want to talk about the concept of dialects and languages because it seems that dialects in a lower position. But I think all linguistically they are equal, right? Equally important for communication. And we talk about language contact as well. Those so-called powerful languages. Again, we see even like the different contexts. We've got various languages. People have different like linguistic repertoires, and we've got language in contact and language in practice. But again, you'll see English is used as a global language, right? It seems it's people taken for granted that we use English for intercultural communication. We use English for international communication. But within different societies, if English is used as an official language, if English is used as a regional lingua franca, whether, okay, the use of English in different contexts, of course, would create this kind of another, right, inequality, or whether there's hierarchy. So here is a quote by Rubdi in this edited volume by Ruani Tupas. Here, one section by Rubdi is about any discussion of English as a global language and its socio-educational implications, therefore cannot ignore the fact that far from being a solution to the dismantling of the unequal power relations in the world. So English is in fact often, for example, English as a medium of instruction is taken for granted, okay, as this de facto language of communication in education, through education. Whether the use of English, right, would create the problems, for example, compared to the relationship of English and the national language, and even the English with some other minority languages. Do you think, yeah, that this kind of situation, right? So English and other languages, even within English, we've got Anglophone varieties, we've got Anglophone Englishes, we've got, sometimes we've got a national variety of English. And also we've got even like a pidgin English, right? If you're familiar with those concepts, it seems that certain use of English is labeled to privilege the use of language, and some certain use of English is labeled as broken English, is uneducated English, right? So here we actually, we talk about English as a medium of instruction, we talk about English as a global language. Some issues would create, right, from the social aspect, from the cultural aspect. That's why we talk about, and also educational aspect. So here, socio-educational implications is very important. So here goes to the role of English in higher education, right? So we are educators, we are learners of English, we are teachers of English. So what should be the role of English? Okay, what does the role of English play in higher education, right? So again, English medium education, English as a medium of education it's kind of popular, right? And people are researching English medium education. And if you realize there is a new journal just launched early this year, right? Journal of English as a medium of instruction. So English as a medium of instruction, English medium education. Okay, if English is used, if English is chosen blindly just by whatever purposes, compared to mother tongue based instruction or compared to bilingual education, even we talk about translanguaging, right? Nowadays, we talk about the more complicated practices of translanguaging, whether English medium as education, whether English as the medium of instruction is the most effective means that people should take, educators should believe, right, in higher education, whether we abandon mother tongue instruction, whether this is less privileged compared to the use of English as a medium of instruction, right? Because we know that universities are competing with each other, and universities would also attract more international students, right? So many universities self-claimed, okay, and themselves as international universities using English as the medium of instruction, right? And again, the role of English we talk about here, whether English functions as a key for employment, whether English is positive, whether English is regarded helpful, beneficial for employment purposes, for the employment opportunities, or English is used as a gatekeeping, right? So when I share this with colleagues, with students, that we have a saying that you learn English for a better future. I think people will see this slogan, right? Learn English for a better future. But whether this is vice versa, if you don't speak English, if you are not a so-called good speaker of English, does it mean that you don't have a bright future? All right, that whether English will play as this gatekeeping. Again, this is an issue. We also need to think about the role of English in higher education and in social contexts, and whether the de facto shared code in higher education is nationalization, or whether the use of English, right, in terms of language policy, language practice, would create linguistic discrimination, right? Because I don't know, in different contexts, if one course is taught through English and another course is taught through the mother tongue, is through the national language, for example, in China is in Mandarin, for example, and another course is taught in English. So students will say, wow, the teacher is more capable, the teacher is more qualified because he or she can teach through English, okay, compared to the teacher who is teaching this course in the native language, in the mother tongue. Students may have this kind of, I don't know, ideologies or perceptions that if the teacher can teach a course in English, he or she is more qualified, and he or students are more willing to choose a course that is lectured in English, right? So to some extent, or even to a large extent, this will create this kind of native speakerism. Yeah, we talk about language teaching methods, we talk about methodologies as well, ELT methodology. So here, again, I guess you are familiar with Holiday's works about native speakerism. Again, it's very powerful for me if you are interested in language teaching or education. But we see that this concept was proposed like a decade ago, 2 decades ago, almost. Still in language teaching, especially English language teaching today, we see that native speakerism is still salient, is still and it's still there, right? So this is a pervasive ideology within ELT, characterized by the belief that native speaker teachers represent a Western culture from which spring the ideals both of the English language and of English language teaching methodology. I think in some other lectures I quoted Holiday's works, and also is the divisive force which originates within particular educational cultures within English-speaking West. So this goes to some other concepts. Again, if you're interested in global Englishes, I'm also researching global Englishes, and we know that native speakerism, we research global Englishes, we research translanguaging, etc. We want to challenge, right, dismantle this kind of ideology, but still in assessment, for example, in teacher recruitment, for example, in students' perceptions, for example, the concept of native speakerism is still embedded and rooted very deeply, okay? So again, two quotes by Kumar Ravadivalu. Again, I think I also share this in some other lectures. It's about the native speaker dominance. And by teachers and students, this is uncritical acceptance of the native speaker dominance. So non-native professionals. So we are non-native professionals, right? Working in the fields of language education, of ELT. So here from Kumar Ravadivalu, non-native professionals legitimize their own marginalization. We take for granted, we kind of assume that we are not as good as the native speakers in terms of teaching approaches, in terms of knowledge of TESOL, etc. So one of the anecdotes that I have is that I heard of a story of a Chinese English teachers telling her students that you'd better choose a course lectured by international teachers, by teachers of American, because she, as a Chinese, believed that she was not as capable as the native speaker of English. Okay, this is the real story that I heard of this story. So very perfect example of how non-native professionals, okay, as we are what we are, legitimize our own marginalization, right? So here, the process of marginalization and the practice of self-marginalization bring to the fore the coloniality rather than the globality of the English language. So we need to, again, to ponder. We talk about the global spread of English. We talk about the so-called dominance of English. As language teachers, as ELT professionals, practitioners, researchers, whether we want to create or recreate this concept of coloniality, if we simply ask people to pursue this Western standard, this native standards in terms of language use or in terms of academy publication as well, right? In terms of accent, speaking, writing. Sorry. So again, from Kumar, this is this long hegemonic shadow over the activity of TESOL. Another example is the textbook use, right? In some other lectures, I also talked about this issue that what type of textbooks that we use in our own contexts. Again, for people to think about like what type of textbooks that you are using in your context, whether it's locally produced or whether it's imported from the Anglophone settings, okay? Whether the textbooks used in your own context is relevant, is context relevant, is context sensitive, or we talk about this interculturally responsive as well, okay? So here another quote is the TESOL profession cannot remain oblivious to the fact that globalization has resulted in greater contexts between people of different cultures, leading to a better awareness of each other's values and visions, and to a firmer resolve to preserve and protect one's cultural liberty. So we talk about intercultural communication. What does it mean by intercultural communication, right? What is the value of our culture, of the local culture, for people to promote, okay, for people to interact with each other? So not only policymakers, but also textbook preparation and production remain a centrally controlled, globally targeted activity with very little role for local ELT professionals. If I stop here, I'll share with you, just forgive me, I'll just stop sharing. for like 30 seconds. Okay, I'm sharing this. Let me see. As an example of this global use of language. Here, we see the idea of how we preserve and protect one's cultural liberty. So my own analysis of the textbook that I myself was using before, and now is used in this a university, right? I just don't talk about which university, but an example of this title of the textbook, and I think you can also refer to this in your own context, right? If you are teaching English, if you are teaching intercultural communication, the English is called Encounters with Westerners, and the subheading of this textbook is Improving Skills in English and Intercultural Communication. So this idea is that who is positioned? Yeah, again, if people think about this in 10, 20 seconds, if we see from a discourse analysis perspective, or even a critical discourse analysis perspective, what do you see from the ideology here? Okay, we have to improve our skills to communicate with Westerners for intercultural communication, right? So we are positioned, if I learn intercultural communication, if I want to use English for intercultural communication, this textbook is designed for readers because readers are regarded as less privileged, as this kind of, not capable of using language, or with this linguistic or cultural deficit. We have to improve to communicate with Westerners. So very interesting here, if I see this from a critical discourse perspective, a critical discourse analysis, CDA perspective, right? And one of the learning outcomes here is to discuss common generalizations concerning Western and Chinese cultures. So in your own contexts, I don't know if you've got like cultural comparison in intercultural communication course. So I think there is a danger if we kind of reproduce this kind of essentialist perspective, understanding culture and understanding communication. Especially we see in the cultural communication, we see culture as something concrete, comparable to some extent, and we have to learn to improve our skills to be capable as a speaker of English for intercultural communication. Right? I think there is a danger of this. So my question is, encounters with Westerners, whether it's equal to intercultural communication, right? So this is the question that we need to think about. Let me move to the original one. Okay. So I move on, is a quote that the tension between retaining the culture and values associated with the mother tongue and the adoption, which one? to this one, sorry. The tension between retaining the culture and values associated with the mother tongue and the adoption of a national identity symbolized by a foreign language is not easy to reconcile, right? So again, as we mentioned, I think still many contexts, especially in contexts that English is regarded as a foreign language. So despite the initiative arguing for the importance of incorporating various aspects of global Englishes into classroom, actual EOT practices seem to be relatively slow to reflect on global Englishes and even translanguaging, right? So this entrenched ideology of native speakerism is still salient in both job market and classroom practices. So like for me, I still find it is very typical, this top-down language policy, and also this the social markets, right? There is still need in the social market that there's a promotion of this Anglophone varieties and the use of English. Okay, so all the background information goes to the need of adoption of translanguaging in language education, for example. And I think this is not a new concept as like everyday language practice. Yeah, so this from language to languaging to translanguaging. So like the other day, when I asked students, what is the meaning of language, right? So students felt puzzled. What does it mean? We are English, we are language majors. So what is the meaning of English? What is the meaning of language, right? Whether language is a noun or a verb. Again, that goes, that question, right? The students were puzzled. Like from a very traditional aspect, language is a noun. We learn Chinese, we learn English, we learn Thai, we speak Spanish, we speak Japanese, of course. But here, the concept, as well as like that language is fixed as a noun, it's similar to the concept that culture is fixed. Culture is nation-based, right? And also culture is concrete. Those essentialist perspective of language of culture really needs to be challenged from this critical pedagogy perspective or from the socio-linguistic perspective, that language right here is using as a verb, and even not through simply translanguaging, but translanguaging. What does it mean by translanguaging? Is that we don't really look at language as codes, right? Not only linguistic practice of language, but language used, we regard language use as a whole, right? We recognize our linguistic repertoire in communication, and communication meaning making as a whole. Yeah, so I think it also challenges this essentialist, concrete, nation-bounded ideology of language and culture, which is important in language education, in applied linguistics. So here, translanguaging is viewed as a cognitive, psychological, social, linguistic, practical theory of language. All right. What does it mean by cognitive, psychological, social, linguistic, practical theory of language? So we see language use is not only verbal, through verbal practice, that language is not like, yeah, communication is not simply verbal. So here, how we process communication, right? It's a complex whole, right? For example, you are listening to a lecture, or you are listening to a course, that's, we've got lots of, cognitive interactions. Even you don't answer this question verbally, you don't communicate, you don't express your idea verbally. We have those cognitive process, how you perceive what you've heard, right? How you like to respond, whether you agree, whether you disagree, whether you want to challenge something. So this is cognitive and also psychological. For example, we talk about psycholinguistics, right? Whether you are willing to answer this question, whether you are willing to interact, to communicate with other people, okay? Whether you feel anxious, whether you feel enjoyable during this lecture, during this course, during this communication process. And social, right? What is this kind of the roles of these interlocutors? Yeah, whether the turn taking, for example, who should go first, whether I want to interrupt, etc. So again, it's a whole. It's not only cognitive only, psychological only, or social only, or linguistic only, right? All those communication is a whole. And we see translanguaging, we see communication. It's not about language use, right? The written language, the spoken language, in terms of grammar, in terms of syntax or semantics, for example. But it's about communication. It's about whether this meaning-making process is successful, whether you this kind of communication can be conveyed, whether meaning can be conveyed successfully. So we talk about translanguaging in language use in education. It's all about communication. It's not about language itself. It's even not about, linguistic features, right? Or grammar of language use. Okay. So here, translanguaging has been adopted to describe bilingual, multilingual speakers' complex linguistic practices. Again, what does it mean by complex language practices? We see, again, as I mentioned, right, cognitive, psychological, social elements. Again, we also recognize people's history, yeah, of language use. We talk about people's history in society, development, growing as a person, right, as an individual. So those are all relevant to the language use, to all this background information, to the knowledge of language use. So bilingual, multilingual speakers, complex language practices, and also this complex historical development, right, in terms of language use and social practices as well. So it's a multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual worlds. That goes to the issue of repertoire. That goes to the topic of this linguistic resources. And then how we express ourselves in different ways. Yeah, we can build up knowledge through the multimodal aspect. We can build up our knowledge through this linguistic contact, for example, to endow the new meaning, right? When people communicate, when people share the same linguistic repertoires. So here, meaning making seems to be more convenient because we share this certain cultural knowledge or linguistic knowledge, and we understand each other. And also embraces translanguaging, also embraces code switching, first language use, multimodal, and further trans-semiotic practices. What does it mean? Sometimes people will say that translanguaging is about shuttling between different codes. Partly, yes, but now translanguaging, like scholars of translanguaging, really sees this not as code switching only. It's not simply about shuttling. Yeah, it's about this multimodal, it's about this trans-semiotic practices as a whole of communication. So like for me, you don't really see me, you don't really listen to my talk, for example. You see me as a person, you see me how my presentation style, my pitch, what type of gestures I use, my eye contact, etc., with the topic itself, whether I'm talking about nonsense, etc., etc. So you're processing, right, those information from different elements, from different ways. If I switch to some other languages, of course, if I assume that we share certain resources, yeah. If I speak Thai, for example, yeah, but I just speak very, very little, right? If we share certain knowledge, it's resource. This is about the use of something added on as resources in learning, especially we talk about planned translanguaging, pedagogical translanguaging, yeah, later. I think in this PowerPoint, yeah, we also talk about this planned translanguaging. So all these ideas from the traditional monolingualism that we have to why do I stop sharing here? Okay, you see the screen, right? So here is the concept, is the idea from monolingualism, from this very traditional teaching concepts or this kind of mindset of monolingual language use. If teachers, for example, code switch, if teachers translanguage, students may regard that teacher as not a capable language teacher because he or she cannot express all in English, and vice versa. From teacher's perspective, if we see a student cannot use monolingually in English, right, the teachers will regard students as this linguistic deficit level, deficient, he or she cannot use English to express well. But from a bilingual education perspective, from this translanguaging aspect, that multilingual speakers are capable, they have this option. They should even be empowered, right, to maximize their repertoires, their linguistic and cultural repertoires in learning, in language use to create new meanings, right? But of course, it depends on different contexts, right? And to what extent, how much translanguaging can be incorporated in learning, for example, in classroom practice, for example. So that is an issue for both language educators and learners to think about, and it needs more empirical findings, more research on translanguaging studies. So at least we recognize that from this translanguaging perspective, language should no longer be viewed as codes. So communication is regarded as a whole. So the perspective of languaging, right, also challenges the concept of named languages and revisits the traditional hierarchy and superiority of the Anglophone varieties of English. So if you still remember, we talk about unequal English, unequal Englishes. That is still, if we can draw a model, but again, I don't really like to draw pictures. I don't really like to talk about models, because again, those are very complicated, very subtle, right? A certain model cannot even represent this kind of hierarchy, superiority of language, but it's there. Certain use of language may be perceived, okay, linked to certain social status, while certain use of English may be perceived as less privileged, as less standard, right? But here, this concept of communication as a whole changes this traditional linguistic ideology. So EOT should recognize the locality rather than simply reinforcing the ideology of coloniality. That again, we have to follow certain standards, native standards, Anglophone standards, right? It's a reproduction of coloniality. Yeah. So again, how do we empower local teachers and also students to link language use and their identity as well? So again, how do we break this kind of dichotomy? I really don't like those kind of this dichotomy of center and periphery is still there. But how do we see this, balance this, right? We don't simply say abandon the center. We don't go from one extreme to another extreme, but we talk about language use. This is a complex process, right? That, how do we take this ownership of English as well? That goes to the issue of how we recognize our own context, use of language and use of English, and how people could move from this monolingual ideology to the multilingual ideology. That's the incorporation of first language, the incorporation of native cultures are no longer, those are no longer perceived as deficit, but as linguistic repertoire, cultural repertoire. And also this is part of the linguistic and cultural capital, right, of different individuals. So from this monolingual ideology to a multicultural one in teaching, in language teaching and learning. Yeah, but of course we don't go really in a mass, right? So we still need to plan, we still need to design the use of language. So that goes to pedagogical translanguaging, yeah. I'll discuss this later. So the prevailing monolingual ideology, the students' first language should be excluded in target language learning has been challenged. But of course, this is not supported by the empirical evidence. So multilingual resources, if I just talk about this linguistic and cultural capital, right? For multilingual speakers, right? How can multilingual speakers maximize learning, achieve a balance between language learning and content understanding, right? We view this as cultural, as linguistic capital. So translanguaging is regarded as a new concept in response to the call for a multilingual perspective in language teaching and learning, right? So I just summarize here some keywords is this multiple discursive practices. We recognize, right, and here is the pedagogical translanguaging, is planned strategies. It's not really unconscious, but pedagogical translanguaging is more consciously used. Translanguaging is more consciously adopted, right? That how learning can be maximized, how learning can be achieved through incorporating people's linguistic repertoire resources, okay? So this is the Cambridge elements that if you're interested in, I don't know whether now it's still open access, but previously it was open access. Yeah, pedagogical translanguaging. Again, yeah, because I just had another lecture recently. So I also want to share this quote with you. Okay, let me share this one. Okay, that's from the book, the 3 dimensions of focus on multilingualism. So here we see multilingual speaker, multilingual repertoire. So those are within the social context. So the social element is important, is significant when we understand translanguaging. And we also need to recognize one end is pedagogical, another is spontaneous. So in social use and social practice, I think we recognize more, right, the spontaneous translanguaging, but also we see the pedagogical translanguaging is planned translanguaging. And the theoretical background of pedagogical translanguaging is based on 3 different theories. One is prior knowledge. People learn from the prior knowledge, okay? That goes to the understanding of language use in relation to the historical development. Yeah, we cannot simply abandon an individual's, a person's historical, right, the social use, the historical reality or whatever it is. This is historical because we have different contact with different people. We live in different places. So we have different linguistic repertoires with this historical development. And we also learn this through the prior knowledge. And the second one is scaffolding, right? How we recognize first language use, how we recognize multimodal, okay, to help scaffolding step by step to build up, learning process. And connected growers, again, is more abstract when we talk about, connected growers compared to prior knowledge and scaffolding. But here, according to Channels and Gorter, they explained this, that the theory of connected growers is based on this dynamic system theory and explains learning and development. So we still recognize applied to language learning and multilingualism, considered language development as a complex, nonlinear dynamic process. Okay. So the theoretical bits. Let me move back to the lecture. Excuse me. So here, okay. So I'd like to introduce an empirical study that I conducted with students. That this one is published. If you're interested in, today I just introduced very briefly. If you're interested, I can share with you this paper, and you can explore this article in more detail. So here we adopted translanguaging into classroom practices, classroom discourse. We want to understand teachers and students' classroom practice and their attitudes towards translanguaging in teaching, okay? And we just summarize at the end with some topics, with some issues on ideology, power inequality, etc. Okay. I think it's good that I share. I think I kind of updated this talk. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Something, the theoretical bits, that I would like to mention, like why we talk about this inclusive education, why we talk about this de-colonising pedagogy, is also based on here this sociocultural theory. That's how educators, teachers, students understand, generate complex ideas, okay, and also to create a secure classroom environment so people feel more confident, right? First language should be used with a purpose, right? We talk about translanguaging, we don't simply say you can use whatever first language is in whatever context. It should be used with a purpose, right? For cross-linguistic comparisons or to make abstract vocabulary. So here, this is ideology, right? The characters of pedagogical translanguaging. So I'd like to introduce, this is an empirical study that we published in Lingua. We had 3 research questions. One, what kinds of translanguaging practices have been adopted by both teachers and students at the Chinese university? Number 2, what are the students' attitudes towards translanguaging practices? Number 3, the teachers' attitudes towards and reasons for translanguaging. Okay, so here we recruited 5 teachers. 3 were language teachers, EFL teachers. 2 were content teachers teaching law. So in that study, we found five different translanguaging practices: concept, language, point explanation, comprehension check, content, knowledge, localization, instruction, reinforcement, and creation of class rapport. So I'll just go through this very quickly, yeah, because the teachers just translanguage through English and Chinese. But again, this concept, as we mentioned, is not simply about shuttling between languages. Yeah, they also use this multimodal aspect to help create learning, right? So number 2 is the comprehension check. Yeah, the teachers want to check the meaning, right, of creativity, utility as well. So teachers will switch to the local language. And the third feature is translanguaging for content knowledge. This was a PowerPoint slide by the teacher. So the teacher here was explaining this, the concepts of the trademark, whether it is moral or not, yeah, with certain concepts. And that is the multimodal language used, right? Through PowerPoint, through these pictures to images to help learning. And this one is the localized concept for understanding. And also translanguaging for instruction reinforcement. So the teachers use English to instruct and also use this the native language to reinforce and also to complete this task. 3 minutes used to Chinese, but to mention hand in your work in 3 minutes to highlight and strengthen her instruction. And the last one is the class rapport. Sometimes we tend to use a joke, right? A shared joke. It's easier for students to understand in a shared language. It's sometimes very difficult to understand in English, but sometimes we have a joke in this mother tongue, in the native language. It's easier for people to understand. And the translanguage as well. So students' attitudes towards translanguaging. The table 2 is about acceptance of teachers' translanguaging practices. So teachers, students, we will see that they find that, okay, if teachers translanguage to explain concepts and also to help less proficient students, two with 3.98, 3.94. Students' acceptance of their own translanguaging practices, of course, compared to the teacher's translanguaging is a bit lower, right? So the highest one is to enable participation by less proficient students. It's similar to students' acceptance of the teacher's translanguaging, right? So in that sense, if we go back to the cognitive psychological element of translanguaging, that students will feel like more secure, yeah, especially for less proficient students, yeah. They were given the option, right? Yeah. So here, the students' attitudes, we see this neutral to positive, and yeah, as there's some other relevant studies that translanguaging was used for various purposes, functions. As we see here, this confidence, improves confidence, facilitates second language learning, and also scaffolding, concepts understanding. Yeah, so it supports the students' needs for translanguaging strategies. So from the teacher's perspective, we found that 2 teachers held this optimal position that they see the value of translanguaging. Yeah, for example, one teacher mentioned this highlighting a point, inject humor, bring us closer. It's very interesting that here we see both, right? Linguistic, yeah, pedagogical purposes. We also see this from a cognitive, from a psychological purposes. So this, again, we talk about communication is not about teaching linguistic level, right? But also how translanguage inject humor in, and also people will feel a closeness, so to bring us closer. Yeah, so sometimes I myself would also translanguage myself, right? To use an example of a joke or even some kind of more complicated communication, right? The embediment of different linguistic cultural resources and stickers, online communication, and people will be more engaged in learning. So we see here not only like highlighting a point, but also some other cognitive, psychological needs of the use of translanguaging. So the teacher interview, we also found this maximal and virtual position. Some teachers felt reluctant to use translanguage, to adopt this strategy in a classroom because, for example, as we mentioned, this rooted ideology that students will challenge the teacher if they don't understand translanguaging to facilitate learning, right? Students tend to challenge the teachers if the teacher does not stick to English only policy, right? And also, this is the practice, even we see this from the micro level, but we also have the macro level, is the departmental policy, is university policy, even the national policy. So here we see this from a macro perspective to the meso perspective. So here the teacher mentions this program, the meso perspective, right? That the courses that the teachers were required to use English only. Presentations and lectures are required to be in English only. And also department meeting, department staff meeting, it was clarified that EMI means implementing the English only policy. And also this one is the principle, right? An unspoken rule that the teachers have to follow this policy, stick to English only policy. But very interesting, we also found that even teachers have this maximal virtual position. One teacher, okay, we had 5 teachers, but in further study, I think it's good that we have more teachers to participate in. And I think it's also good that we have more universities and more participants from different contexts to understand, right, the various needs and purposes of translanguaging. So despite the English-only policy, the teacher participants utilize translanguaging strategies to facilitate content teaching, including concept, language point explanation, comprehension check, and content knowledge localization. Teachers show different positions towards translanguaging. Okay, so the teachers in favor of translanguaging strategies recognize more functions of translanguaging. So we also see the challenges. One is about the monolingual policy. Second is about students' overuse of their first language. And then goes back to Channels and Gorter, that first language should be used with a purpose, right? So again, there is another issue is that we haven't really researched the effectiveness of translanguaging as well, all right? So I think in the future, for further study, we need to research the effectiveness, whether it's EMI, English only, or compared to the effectiveness if teachers and students practice translanguaging, but from a more spontaneous or natural way, right? For some researchers, they're interested in pedagogical translanguaging. So they do this from a planned manner, that they see the knowledge acquisition through planned pedagogical translanguaging. So we go back to the use of English, we go back to EMI. It does not mean that mastery of English only would naturally lead to optimal outcomes in terms of content, subject learning, and enhancement of English language proficiency. Again, this goes back to the claim that I just put forward, that learning English for a better future. Does it mean vice versa? Does it mean that teachers or students, we don't learn English, we don't have a future? Okay, so again, we see the role of English. This is a question for us to consider, right? And then also the adoption of English as a language of instruction should be contextualized. Again, not only from the departmental level, but also it should be contextualized by recognizing the needs of the stakeholders, of the people involved. Okay, so we also need to consider the feasibility and availability of the resources for EMI and understand first languages and local cultures as resources when we go back to the linguistic and cultural repertoire. So here it goes to the use of translanguaging, to the adoption of translanguaging, to challenge this linguistic inequality and linguistic racism. So we see this multimodal education, multilingual education, right, for the field of TESOL, for a dynamic cultural linguistic repertoires for students, and also to systematic and contextualized translanguaging pedagogical strategies. But again, it's not easy. And again, when we talk about translanguaging, we don't want to impose translanguaging either. This is something we need to understand, right? And of course, we have got the biases from Professor Li Wei. There's still various challenges with these different biases. Also, the ELT transition, this is the promotion of translanguaging that we really recognize focuses on multilingualism from multilingual speakers, and also English as the whole English and the whole linguistic repertoire of different individuals, right? We need to recognize the social context of language use. So a very quick summary is that we really need to view this language education from a multilingual lens, recognizing students' first language use and also the linguistic and cultural resources for an anti-racist pedagogy, and also from this de-colonizing pedagogy, right? Making visible the racialized nature of language. And the summary here is that world Englishes or global Englishes and translanguaging share multilingual ideologies to the developing of multilingualism in education elsewhere, this kind of multilingual ideologies. So a quick summary, I think in some other lectures, I also quoted Lippy Green about language use, whether we want to reproduce this kind of intimidation in terms of this linguistic discrimination, linguistic racism, or we want to promote this kind of, to challenge this, promotes the equality of language, to challenge inequality of language, okay? So I think this is the main content of this translanguaging, to decolonize language education and as to promote inclusive education. In another 10-15 minutes, I'd like to talk about translanguaging research methods, because again, for people who are interested in translanguaging, we may think about what translanguaging really is, because theories, like scholars talk about translanguaging as a practical theory of language. We talk about translanguaging as a practice, as a strategy, as a tool, right? People are puzzled what translanguaging really is. And even this new journal launched early this year, Research Methods in Applied Linguistics, people start to recognize translanguaging research methodologies and translanguaging as methods. All right, very interesting that we look at translanguaging from a qualitative perspective. So one thing we need to understand that translanguaging as a phenomenon is a socially situated language practice, as well as a practical theory of language, right? So again, we'll talk about the focus of translanguaging in communication. language and communication. The pluralistic communication in everyday contexts is frequently a spontaneous and ongoing rather than predictable or formulaic process. Again, this goes to pedagogical, right? More planned translanguaging, to this spontaneous translanguaging, social use of translanguaging, that we look at translanguaging from a more like social aspect, right? Yeah, so one way, again, if you remember, one end is the pedagogical one, it's more like planned one. Another end is more like this spontaneous translanguaging, okay? So for example, before my talk today, right, I didn't plan what I would talk about, what I should talk about, right? So I just, it's more spontaneous language use. Yeah, and if I translanguage, if I understand some shared languages or some other cultural repertoire. So here, autoethnography is one thing, it's one method that people can apply in, for creativity and reflexivity for translanguaging. Yeah, again, if we just talk about the history of individual, we are the person, we know, we understand our linguistic history, social, cultural history. So how we understand this, how we adopt autoethnography in our own, to understand our own translanguaging practice, our willingness to translanguage, and also some mistakes or some other anecdotes, whatever, misunderstandings, anecdotes of translanguaging. So this is the one way is the creativity. Another way is the reflexivity, right? So from researching translanguaging to translanguaging research methodologies, again, how we challenge the very traditional, right, quantitative questionnaire, qualitative interview, observation, case study, focus group, whatever, right? I think in applied linguistics, what kind of new research methods do we need, right? This is how we translanguage research methods. Yeah, so Professor Li Wei wrote a response to this paper. I'm going to introduce very briefly later. So translanguaging is regarded as a multilingual, multisemiotic, multisensory, and multimodal resource that human beings use for thinking and for communicating thoughts. So it's to understand, right, everyday conversation as knowledge production. Okay, so a question proposed by Li is that what is to be gained by reorienting ourselves to what counts not only as language, but as knowledge about language? Some traditional questions that people would ask if they want to adopt translanguaging, right? The sample size to translanguaging. Again, from so-called systematic research methods, this is the question that people would ask, right? But again, Li mentions that translanguaging, the question of sample size would entail presenting data in a provisional and exploratory manner, but not as an inherent limitation, as in a conversational sense of pilot study that is only appropriate for a poster session or a working paper, but publishable yet necessary, incomplete, in line with our understanding of translanguaging as a bottom-up, ongoing, and negotiable practice of communication. So here, the topic, the issue is that we need to ask questions such as, to what extent is the question of sample size important, or perhaps not, to understand the realities of translanguaging as an individualized and therefore oftentimes idiosyncratic phenomenon. So here, autoethnography research on translanguaging. Sample size is not something that typical, right, in translanguaging research. Yeah. And of course, we need to readdress the epistemological understanding of translanguaging, not all to endorse the concept without critical reflection, right? So translanguaging research methodology is an opportunity to resist the all too common tendency to insist on methodology for the sake of methodology. So again, this is not easy to understand, right? But we need to break this kind of image of very, very traditional methodology in applied linguistics to broaden our purview of what is or is not legitimate research and expand our capacities to make sense of language as it's being practiced in the real world today. So that is something we talked about, this translanguaging methods. So this one was published, I think, just early last month when Professor Li Wei just responded partly of Lee's, yeah, partly responded this paper. Yeah, Jerry Wang Lee's paper. So here I want to focus on here that translanguaging is regarded as a method. Again, experience, lived experience that bilinguals and multilinguals have. So those who have been socialized into knowing and using patterns of linguistic structures, bodily movements, and symbolic practices that scholars identify and assign to differently named languages and cultures. So here there is Li called for a method, called for the methodological shifts that shifts away from language as abstract goals to focus on meaning making and sense making. Okay. And also to integrated experience that Li mentioned something that this methodological section, yeah, he wanted to challenge this methodological section. Yeah, that I have found it deeply unsatisfactory to have to declare for this is from Li Wei, yeah, for my own papers that this is a critical essay, not a report on a single piece of empirical research. So, for this translanguaging studies, this method seems not to be there as a section, as a method section. So Li proposes moment analysis that is not yet noticeable, but the participants of social interaction and by the analysts. For example, respondents in the conversational interaction understand people's life, right? The noticeability of the moment means that a moment worth analyzing has procedural consequentiality, right? So this kind of, from this analysis, this analysis is concerned with if and how the context or the setting of social interaction has any consequences for the shape, form, trajectory, content, or character of the interaction that the parties conduct. So we need to understand the social, again, social, psychological, cognitive, and the history, okay, of individual, right? Shape, form, trajectory, content, characters of the interaction as a whole. So Li promotes this moment analysis, right? From the ethnographic approach, linguistic landscaping approach, working methods, right? This meta-languaging data. Yeah, we are exposed to these various social, the societies, social elements. We see the views, we see many, right? So working method as well. So here, lived experiences are personal and time, and context sensitive and cannot be reproduced by others in a different setting at a different time. So that's something very, very typical, something very special to individuals, right? So feelings and emotions that are so critical in personal experiences get lost in big data, and the obsession with reproducibility. We talk about the reproduce, right, of this big data with this numeral data, statistics. We like these numbers, of course. We understand the nature of, for example, a teaching method, and also attitudes, whatever. So we kind of apply linguistics field, we tend to analyze data, the numeral data, but here from leeway, right? We have to understand lived experiences of different individuals to understand the feelings, emotions, right? To understand this different lived experience, personal experience, those are very context, time sensitive, that cannot be reproduced. Yeah, so this is about the moment. Yeah, this is about the sensitivity of moment analysis. So here, moment analysis calls for more attention to be paid to them, as they can fundamentally change our courses of actions and patterns of behavior. So the descriptions of these momentary actions and events may result in what people call anecdotes. Again, in this paper, this is not a long one. This is a short conceptual, even like a response paper. I find it very powerful in terms of this concept of anecdotes. Why do we understand anecdotes? It's important because the quote here, we all grow up with anecdotes, right? We learn from anecdotes and we live by anecdotes. This is why anecdotes can be used as a way, right? As moment analysis to understand the everyday human life in terms of communication, right? Linguistic practices, to understand the nature of communication through translanguaging. That's why we talk about here that translanguaging is regarded as a method. Right? Transcripting, this is another example that the incorporation of translanguaging in social media. So some questions that Li and Zhu proposed is that characters, again, not only Chinese characters, but in your contexts, right? Your languages as well, be used to reflect the actual pronunciation and accent of the language users in social interactions. Should social media users choose characters to match their pronunciation or accent, instead of using the standard characters that do not reflect their actual pronunciation or accent? And how can they create new characters for new concepts, objects, and expressions? And the implication of choosing existing characters for new concepts, objects, and expressions. Okay, excuse me, just one second, yeah. So we see this combination of different languages as a whole to create new meaning. If you're familiar with stickers, right, many people create various languages, multimodals, semiotics, as into one sticker for new meaning. And sometimes if you are a follower of the language nerds, social media accounts, lots of examples of this new meaning, creativity through this various forms of meanings, through this linguistic elements, semiotic elements, multimodal element, right? I think I'll just sum up here that translanguaging is the concept not only in social language use, but also in terms of challenging the fixed ideologies of language. 5 minutes that I'd like to introduce the two special issues that colleagues and I are co-editing. One is translanguaging in language teaching and learning, current practices and future directions. This one was published early last month, the second volume of 2022. And in this special issue that I co-guest edited with Lawrence Zhang and Prof. Sa, all the collections, contributions of this issue answer the questions: how can the adoption of pedagogical translanguaging facilitate language and content learning? What are the challenges regarding the use of translanguaging in academic settings? What are stakeholders' perceptions of the use of translanguaging in both academic and non-academic settings? How can the adoption of translanguaging promote inclusive education and a decolonizing pedagogy? We found that very powerful. We are fortunate to have those collections, papers. They're very, very helpful from the pedagogical perspective and from the social use perspective. So here you'll see the example, very interesting. You feel free to read this issue, right? The two main themes of this issue. One is translanguaging to facilitate learning. Another one is translanguaging for inclusive education as a decolonizing pedagogy. So I just quoted the editorial here, is that this is a time for all of us to be reminded of the possibilities that the trans era urges traditional second language acquisition to move beyond the restricted native norms in language learning, but instead focus on the realistic language use for dynamic needs and goals of language learners and for communication in situ, where people adopt various multimodal and semiotic resources, right? And of course, we have those questions for people, if you are interested in translanguaging. It's not the must to be used, I would say, teaching method or approach, right? Still, it needs to be understood to make this the context sensitive, right? But of course, this is a very powerful concept to promote inclusive education and a decolonizing pedagogy to promote social justice and linguistic equality. Another special issue that Dr. Sander Dovchin and I are co-edited. Again, many papers have been published online. Is in Applied Linguistic Review is the reflection and reform of applied linguistics from the global south. So here we want to understand this power inequality, right, in English user from the global south. We want to promote this fairness and also the inclusive education as well. So here we are focused, we've got different contexts. Again, I just mentioned, we don't talk about this dichotomy of global north or global south, right? We need to understand even people based in global north should really understand this hierarchy and also privilege marginalization of language use. It's not about the geographical context. It's about the language use, it's about the practice itself, okay? That we talk about global south, global north, it's not about geographical contexts. Yeah. So in global north, for example, we can still understand, we can still research this inequality, etc. So again, the quote is this concept, this global north, global south, is from Pennycook and Marconi. The one way to approach inequality is through decolonizing language, challenging the ways language has been constructed in the global south and opening space for alternative ways of thinking about language, right? And again, it goes to the similarity of language in the global south is this similarity of the lives of the English learners and English users from this. So we need to understand the, I would say, the individual cases, the lived experience of these individual cases, stories, to rectify the balance in recent debates around these concepts, right? So something we'll need to understand here. So again, the quotes from the editorial as well. That's, is it possible, again, the question, is it possible to move beyond monolingual ideologies and orientations and contradiction to linguistic imperialism, separation, purification, and unproficiency of English from the global south perspective, right? That's the question for language educators. We all need to understand, right? And also, should English be considered either hegemonic, dominating, or liberating, empowering? Yeah, from a global south perspective. So how do language educators or users in a global south respond to the complexity of English against the backdrop of mono, bi, or multilingualism? So as address, okay, so again, this issue, but for language educators, for teachers, for researchers, we also need to think about, right? How do we address aspects related to power, discrimination, inequality, ideology, and identity from the perspective of the global south in applied linguistics, focusing on multiple contexts from the global south? I think, yeah, I like to use this quote to sum up. I think I do this in some other lectures, that language is a practice that constructs and is constructed by the ways language learners understand themselves, their social surroundings, their histories, and the possibilities for the future. That's why I like to link this theory of identity, understanding identity, because we know that Norton and Tahi, they are interested in identity research to translanguaging. That how do we incorporate the concepts? Again, as we talk about translanguaging and this, in relation to the history of an individual, to the cognitive, the psychological, the social, linguistic elements of an individual. So we need to understand here the connection of identity to a language use as a whole, rather than, of course, the translanguaging practices, the history, right? How we understand ourselves from the past, now, and future, the historical use, identity, and the history, and also the social surroundings. This is the context. So again, translanguaging is very important. We talk about context sensitive, and also possibilities for the future, not only this identity construction, but the future use of language. And some of the references, yeah, if you are interested in language and translanguage. I think this is all what I want to talk today. And I hope you are interested in this concept. And yeah, any comments, suggestions are welcomed. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Associate Professor Dr. Fang from Shantou University, for your knowledge contribution. For today's session, you have introduced many different concepts which open our view that plays crucial roles in TESOL's profession, both in ESL and EFL contexts. including global roles of English, English medium instruction, linguistic racism, linguistic discrimination, native speakerism, and how these concepts relate to translanguaging concept, which is a relatively newly coined term in ELT and learning practices. For our lovely audience, now it's time for Q&A session. So if you have any questions to ask or experience to share, it's more than welcome. And you can either send your questions via the chat box, or you can unmute your microphone and ask the speaker directly if you would like to.
I think I saw the comment, the questions on the chat box.
Yes, there's a question.
Yeah, if I could answer this
yes, sure.
very briefly. So those are very, very important questions. The first one is about whether we assume, right, the implicit assumption that translanguaging, that the instructors and teachers share this common L1. Yes, the case is that in that situation, it probably is easier, right? But of course, we also recognize students, if we have an international group of students, we also recognize that sometimes if the teacher, lecturers and students do not share this linguistic repertoire, the first language, sometimes students themselves would share this linguistic repertoire, right? So students can also translanguage among themselves. For example, if they are doing this classroom discussion, for example, they can switch by using their resources if they want to incorporate translanguaging. And if the students and teachers do not share this first language, they can still go back to this shared language, for example, English in that case, to report to the class if they don't share this linguistic repertoire. But for some other practices where students, for group discussion, they can share. And yeah, the similarities of this bit. And also if they don't share this, they incorporate, they can explain the purposes, why they translanguage, and the function of translanguaging practice, right? One of the criticisms of translanguaging is this assumption of, yes, teacher-student, some of the assumption, yeah, has been taken for granted. And again, we, as I mentioned, we don't want to impose this ideology as well, this practice as well. We need to understand this, as we, thank you, yeah, Jens, as you mentioned, this institution-based language learning context. Again, to what extent and how much extent that translanguaging could have a position, we also need to recognize this language learning contexts, right? Yeah, this is the meso level policies and practices. Yes, it is very important, and we don't want to patronize this as well. And this goes to the next question: does translanguaging promote better learning outcome? It really depends, right? At least when we talk about translanguaging, some empirical evidence would say that translanguaging promotes this, would help students gain confidence. Students will feel more secure. They feel less anxious in terms of language use. But learning outcome, again, depends on what type of learning outcome does the course really want, right? If they want to produce language use, probably not. But again, if translanguaging will kind of promotes or to teach content. So some teachers, some studies, we found that the application of translanguaging in content learning, some empirical evidence has shown that yes, especially for lower intermediate language users, translanguaging does promote content learning. Yeah, content learning compared to EMR, especially when pedagogical translanguaging is applied when teacher students and teacher researchers collaborate, yeah, translanguaging into teaching. Yes, we've not me, some other studies found this effectiveness of translanguaging for certain learning outcomes, but mainly for content learning. But of course, it depends, right? Yeah, if further research, I don't know, may also show that translanguaging might not promote learning outcome if students are more capable, they are more willing to learn this through their shared, through English, for example, or they want to publish, they want to deliver, I don't know, for international conferences. So English is still a very, very important resource and that type of capital for them. Yeah, in that case, maybe another story. Yeah. So again, we cannot have this clear-cut answer. But yes, some studies found translanguaging promote better learning outcome. But still, we need more empirical research. Maybe we also found that translanguaging might not promote learning outcome. Yeah, and content as well. What type of content, right? Maybe it's delivered by this different lecturers, right? And different elements of translanguaging. So we still need more research. Yeah. How researchers can investigate the effectiveness of translanguaging. Again, I think it goes to how we define effectiveness, right? It's difficult for me to elaborate because it goes to the definition of effectiveness. If we want to see whether translanguaging, the adoption of translanguaging into this control group or experimental group for an IELTS score or for this content score, that's the one example of effectiveness. Another type of effectiveness is that if the adoption of incorporation of translanguaging promotes or encourage students to express themselves for content learning, for knowledge production, that might be another story of effectiveness, right? So whether, yeah, I think it's open for different research. It goes to how we define effectiveness, right? Some people, yeah, they are doing like translanguaging in CLIL, multimodality in CLIL, all right? So that goes to different, yeah, research methods and areas. Could we briefly, translanguaging is very bilingual. If again, for translanguaging scholars, it's not about bilingual because it's different from linguistic practice. We see communication as a whole, right? We see meaning making as a whole. Meaning making is not simply through verbal communication, but it's through eye contact. If, for example, if I turn off, talk about this lecture, if I turn off this camera, if I do this translanguaging, if I switch to Thai, if I speak Thai, unfortunately, I can only speak very simple Thai, right? Like kopun kap, like something. This communication is different from what I turn on this camera if I do this language communication. If a Thai speaker is doing, right, a lecture that we share more resources, right? Maybe the Thai speaker can incorporate more translanguaging, but through this multimodal pictures, images, if I also draw pictures, if I use a whiteboard for communication, right? If I, okay, let me turn on this whiteboard. If I want to introduce, I cannot use this. Huh? If I turn on this whiteboard doing this multimodal practices, if I show these pictures, etc. for communication. Yeah. So not simply bilingual ones, but also various aspects. And one thing is that if we look at translanguaging in social practice, we give people freedom, we give people an option that you are able to choose the language or whatever resources that you want to use to achieve this learning goal, this learning end, and also in daily communication, right? If you are not have this option that you are asked to stick to certain language, you don't have this option. That goes to the social practice. This is why translanguaging is similar. It's not similar to simply linguistic level. It's beyond language level. So it's not simply about code switching one code to another, right? That people can communicate through one code, another switch, and then for what purposes? It's more complicated. Yeah, it's more like a complex whole of communication. So we recognize this model, this multimodal, this semiotic model, right? We can create pictures, we can create images to help people understand what I mean. Yeah, okay. So I think that's all these questions on the chat box.
Yes, I think so. Not sure if anyone still have any question to ask our speaker today. Before we are going to close the session. Okay, if there is no question, maybe I have one question. Just okay. I mean, from your perspective, I just would like to know what is the most challenging experience or issues in implementing the concept of translanguaging in English language education, especially in the context where English is utilized as a foreign language and the concept of the native speaker is still strongly embedded in English educational stakeholders, including learners, teachers, or policymakers, and curriculum designer as the most appropriate English teachers.
Okay, thank you. I think one thing is about the flexibility and availability of these resources and also the policies. That's how supportive, for example, policymakers, if teachers, if they are not given this flexibility, for example, they will be penalized if they switch, if they incorporate different resources, for example. So that's a challenge. Another challenge is that we don't want translanguaging as an excuse for teachers and for students that they don't learn well. Okay, so sometimes there is a misconception is that it's an excuse. If we incorporate translanguaging, that students simply say, oh, I can translanguage. I can use, for example, my first language, or whatever pictures, if they create pictures, if they use stickers in learning, whatever it is. We don't want to make this as an excuse for not to learn well, right? So translanguaging should be used with a purpose, with a learning purpose that they need to collaborate. Yeah, this is also like this. We talk about this community of practice, and we talk about this learning needs, learning ends. So the challenge is that people don't understand the need of translanguaging. So they will say it's an excuse for not teaching well. It's an excuse for not learning well. This is again from the user's perspective, but also from more like top-down perspective is the policy of this. So I think we need to understand like why, in what circumstances that translanguaging is used. Okay, we don't use translanguaging just simply by using translanguaging, forcing people to translanguage. So again, just like global English is, we challenge this native speakerism ideology. Okay, we don't want to go from one extreme to another extreme. We still recognize the resources, okay, of this native use of language, various resources, and also translanguage. We don't want to abandon, right, some this is native use of language, this resources, and we don't abandon English as a key way of success and resource that students need to master as well. All right, we just want to use translanguaging to facilitate learning, to create this inclusive education and decolonizing pedagogy. So that's something. Yeah, when we talk about translanguaging, we don't want to make it as an excuse. We don't want to make it to another extreme, not to learn well. So I think that's something from this theory, practice, approach itself, and also for teachers who use people who translanguage. But it's very common, right, in daily communication. The translanguaging is already there for our daily communication, especially when we use translanguaging through social media, right? But again, for learning, that's what we need to understand, the purposes and goals of the adoption of translanguaging. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. It seems there are still two persons who like to share and discuss idea with you. The first one, Hesti, I guess. Yeah. Hesti, would you like to anything to say to Professor?
Oh, yes, sir. Thank you for the. Okay. Right. So thank you for the chance. So I just like to share my own experience based on my understanding on your lecturer. First is translanguaging is all about about the communication of the language and not the language itself. So, and also the background of translanguaging is like one of them is a scaffolding. So and also if the teacher and student cannot share the same language, so they always come back to the shared language. So in my classroom I did the scaffolding, but somehow it offers scaffold to my students. So they sometimes they cannot go with themselves in practicing the language without, for example, my questioning to them for what's the next topic that they will talk about. So that's the thing that I want to share today.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, I'll just make a very quick comment. I think if one way is that if the teachers and students do not share the first language, very traditional way of teaching is that students are expected to follow the teacher and use English. Yeah, but one thing that whether it's possible that if the teacher teach in a certain context, whether it's possible that the teacher also learn from students and also learn in the daily life and daily communication out of the classroom to understand this broader social context and the language of the students. And I think in that sense, the teachers can also make some resources to students, yeah, when they kind of, whatever translanguaging or not, but I think students are always excited when the teachers can bring something to them. If the teachers are learning something, right, from their perspective. That I think this is I think two ways or even three different ways: the teacher, student, and the society. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, now let's move to Professor James Franks. Yes.
Yes, thanks very much, Professor Fang, for answering my earlier question in the chat. The reason why I'd asked the question is to share a bit of autoethnography because, well, as you can see now from my appearance, I'm a foreigner teacher. I mean, well, you can guess then as well, foreigner teaching English in Thailand. And so when I use Thai to my students, for exactly, you mentioned this study earlier on, so the acceptance of translanguaging practices in the classroom. And instinctively, intuitively, I use a lot of these. Clarify comprehension, classroom language, all these elements, right? But what I do feel in terms of a Bourdieuian sense of capital, linguistic and cultural capital, social capital as well, I think me using Thai as a target language is perceived very differently by the students than if a Thai lecturer would do that. And even I would venture with a Thai lecturer, they might look at, okay, is this a Thai lecturer, Pung Chop Matayom, Pung Chop Pranyato, so he's just, or she's just finished their master's degree in a Thai university, or is it someone who got their PhD from the UK? So it's a really complex package. It's a fascinating topic. I just think, yes, exactly, we have to sort of nuance out the background because there's lots of ascriptions of social capital in there. That's my sort of gut feeling. Thank you.
Thank you. I really second this point. I think it's very interesting for me, a Chinese teaching English in China, and like, for example, like Yusuf as a Thai teaching English in Thailand, And as like Professor Evgeny, Bulgarian teaching, students may see this from a different perspective. If they will think that why do you learn my language, for example, like in terms of, to some extent, they feel something. And one thing is that if like a foreigner use Chinese, we tend to answer in English. So when you speak Thai to your Thai students, the students may still respond in English. This is the assumption as well, right? So I think this is all the issues of capital, resources, and that's why we talk about the personal, individual, historical experience. When we understand this linguistic resource, I think one thing that we can introduce our own life experience to students, telling them, why do I teach English in Thailand? My own learning experience, my own linguistic experience, right? Competence, why I'm interested in Thai language. And you would expect that sometimes I would use your language to facilitate. And in that sense, students may feel more comfortable. Instead of sometimes, students would, oh, you can speak that's language. I talk about something secretly in my language and you could understand this. So that's very interesting. And yes, autoethnography and even dual ethnography, a foreigner teaching English in Thailand, a Thai lecturer teaching English in Thailand. Autoethnography, dual ethnography through a translanguaging perspective, that might be a very interesting piece of research, right?
Agreed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so because now it seems like we are running out of time. On behalf of the organizing team, I would like to thank all of you for joining the fruitful discussion session today. And I hope you have earned the knowledge you wish for from the activity. And please do not forget to apply what you have learned today to your academic careers. And before we call it a day, I would like to ask for your cooperation to fill out a survey so that we can review your comments and feedback and improve our future events. And we are going to send you the link of the survey in the chat box. Okay, it seems my staff already sent the link of the survey already. So everyone, please complete the link and also please after you complete the link for the survey, please do not forget to grab your e-certificate before leaving the session. We are about to send you the certificates link also in the chat box as well. Okay, now we have sent you two different links. The first link is just like assessment for the survey, and the second link is for your certificate. And regarding the certificate, when you visit the link, please fill out your name and email, and the system will automatically use the information provided to send you the certificate, and you can check in your email right after. And the as you are completing the survey and getting your certificate, I would like to take this opportunity to announce our next event under the PSU Open Mobility Program to be held on October 26th. In this educational event, you will meet with the Associate Professor, Dr. Will Baker from Southampton University, England, who will be sharing knowledge and experiences with you on the topic of global citizenship, English medium education, and ELT. And here is the link for the academic coming event in October. So if you are interested, do not hesitate to sign up by checking the new link in the chat box. And we do hope to see you all again soon in October. Have a nice day for today. Thank you very much for your actively participation today. Everyone, please have a good day. And thank you very much, Professor Fang, for your accepting the invitation again. And we are going to see you again next year, right?
I think later this year. You
at the end of
the
this
time.
year, right? The end of this year is our publication, right?
Yeah.
So you're coming back in different topics, right? For now, it's
different topics.
They're very different topics. It's about publications, qualitative publications in international journal. So everyone, please stay tuned. So for today, again, thank you very much again, everyone. So, and we hope to see you again in October on 26th.
Thank you. Bye-bye.